Hi guys, and welcome back to Elizabeth Ann Reads. Today we're doing my 10 great books of 2020. Now, to avoid any confusion right off the bat, this is not my top 5. As I was going through my list and figuring out how I was going to do my best of the year, there were 5 that just absolutely jumped out at me, separate from the rest of the list. And so I'm going to make a separate top 5 video for those, my top 5 reads of the year. This is everything that falls right under that top 5. So these are still fantastic books. These are still 4 or 5-star reads. They're ones I highly recommend that you pick up. They just didn't quite inch their way into the top 5, which I read 187 books this year. So to hit the top 5 out of that means, 182 books did not make that top 5. And there's still a lot of fantastic books in there. So these are my top tier, just not like exceptional tier of the year. So 10 books that I read. They're in no particular order. I'm not going to try and rank them. We're just going to go through them, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, and then you're going to go pick them up. So the first book I have on the list is one that I would not count as eligible because it's a reread. But it struck me so much this year, and no one talks about it. It's a totally obscure book, and I want you all to read it, so I've decided to include it on my list. And that is Momo by Michael Ende. Michael Ende is a German author. He's better known for The Never-Ending Story, and this is another one of his works. Very few of his works have been translated to English. I've only been able to find 3: Never-Ending Story, this one, and then another one called The Night of Wishes, which I have on my shelf, but I haven't read yet. This is the story of Momo, who's a homeless girl. This is set in a fantasy world. I would almost call it a dystopian, although not in the vein of what we think of dystopian in our modern age. This was written in 1973, and we follow Momo, who is a little homeless girl, and we just follow her story. She lives in this kind of abandoned amphitheater, and she has this ability to draw people to her. People flock to her because she listens. She just takes time and she listens to them, and she tells them stories sometimes. But she just has this gift of listening, so people come to her because they feel valued, because she is giving them her full attention. And she doesn't even have to talk a lot of the time. She just listens, and they kind of work through their problems as they're talking to her. So people start sending others to her as, oh, you have a problem, go talk to Momo. And people will just talk through all these problems, and it's kind of this thing. And then these men in gray show up. This title is sometimes translated, I think, as The Gray Men or Men in Gray. So if you see that, it's the same book. But these gray men show up, these men in gray suits, I should say, and they are time savers. I can't remember the term that's used in the book, but they go around convincing people to save time, to put it like we would in a bank, to put time in a bank account, more or less, and save it and gain interest on it, and then you'll get all this extra time back. And so people start doing all these things to save time, and no one goes to see Momo anymore, because no one has time to talk to her. And so she starts wondering what's happened to all her friends, and the story goes from there. I know it sounds like I just gave you the whole synopsis. I didn't. This technically is a children's book. I think it's greater appreciated by adults, but it just kind of goes into the depth of how we value time, and what truly is valuable. Is saving time the most important thing, or is, our relationships, our living life? It addresses some of those questions in a really, really unique and interesting way. I want to read you one little quote from the book. This is when people first start saving time. People never seemed to notice that by saving time they were losing something else. No one cared to admit that life was becoming ever poorer, bleaker, and more monotonous. The ones who felt this most keenly were the children, because no one had time for them anymore. But time is life itself, and life resides in the human heart. And the more people saved, the less they had. And I just think this is a really thoughtful little book. It's short. You can read it pretty quick. I would recommend not rushing through it and taking your time with it. But I just think this book is totally unknown and underrated, and more people need to read it. So please go pick this up. The next book I want to talk about is Dig for a Treasure by Dean Marshall. You can tell this is an old edition because this book is out of print. So good luck finding it. Once before, I think I mentioned on my channel this book, which is called The Invisible Island, also by Dean Marshall. This is a book I grew up reading. It's one of my all-time favorite books. It is just one of those very old-fashioned kind of adventure stories. You follow this family with 4 children who move to the country and discover on their properties there's actually an island, and they decide they want to be shipwrecked on the island for the summer and just have all these adventures. It's a fantastic book. I absolutely love this book. I just found out a couple of years ago that there are actually sequels to it, namely Dig for a Treasure. There's also a third one. But again, out of print, very difficult to find, but my amazing mother tracked down a copy of Dig for a Treasure, and I read it this year. And this just continues the stories of these 4 children. They make some new friends. They have more adventures on their island. And this was one of possibly the most magical reading experiences I've ever had. And I don't want to oversell it, because if you read these books for a first time as an adult, it's not going to be the same. But when you grew up with these kids, and it's like if all of a sudden a whole new Narnia book was discovered, like written by C.S. Lewis, same world, same writing, and all of a sudden there's just this whole new story that involves this world you love. That's what it felt like reading this. Like, it was absolutely an amazing experience for me to read this book, and that's why it's hitting the top of this list. I love these stories. If you ever find copies of these, don't hesitate, pick them up. They're just such lovely, old-fashioned, just beautiful little adventure stories. I have one more middle grade book that I want to talk about, and this is one I read way back in March, for middle grade March, and it's called The Story That Cannot Be Told by J. Casper Kramer. This was, I don't know if it came out in 2020 or 2019, but it was a fairly new release when I read it. And it's also a debut release from this author. And this is historical fiction. I always feel odd to refer to things that happened during my lifetime as historical, but technically it is. It's set in 1989 in Romania, which, if you know any Romanian history or Eastern European history, that's when the fall of communism was happening in Romania. I originally picked up this book because my family has some ties to Romania. I've been there. I have a Romanian sister-in-law. And so I picked it up mostly because I was just interested in the fact that it was set in Romania, and I wanted to kind of get a perspective on the history, some of that history. But this was a great, fantastic little middle grade story. We follow Ileana, who, again, young girl, she ends up being sent to live with her grandparents because there's a lot going on. There's a lot of undercurrents going on. There's a lot of kind of secret things happening and whisperings, and a lot of civil unrest. Not that we know what that's like at all. And so her parents decide to send her away to live with her grandparents. She's never met her grandparents before, but she goes to live with them. They're thinking they're protecting her, but things are still happening. Even outside of the city, there's just all these kind of undercurrents happening as things kind of come to a head in the political and government. There's a lot of kind of folk tales blended into the story, which is also really interesting. You get some Romanian folk tales in there. And yeah, I just thought it was a really, really well done, well written, but also just a really interesting kind of snapshot of a time period in history that I think a lot of us aren't as familiar with, especially with the Romania setting. So I would highly recommend. Middle grade March is coming up again soon, so I would recommend putting this one on your list for sure. All right, next up, let's talk about The Humans by Matt Haig. First of all, I hate this cover. Second of all, his newest book, The Midnight Library, has been getting some buzz in the last couple months. I've read that one too this year and really enjoyed it, but I liked this one better. I actually read this during a Dewey's 24-hour readathon. It was my first experience with Matt Haig, and I thought it was really, really good. In this story, we follow a character, Professor Andrew Martin, who has just solved this mathematical equation that was supposed to be unsolvable. He solved some big world problem by doing this. But the aliens who have been monitoring Earth don't want the humans to have this information. They don't want them to have the solution for whatever it is. So they send an alien to basically get rid of Professor Andrew Martin, and then make sure that they take care of anybody that he may have told that he solved this. Obviously, it's not public information yet, but they go to check out, his colleagues, his wife, his family, to make sure anyone that knows about this solution is, not a problem, is taken care of. So this is basically an ET story, but told from the perspective of the alien. And he comes to Earth. These aliens are disgusted by humans. They think everything we do is disgusting, and the things we like and our passions in life are just gross. And so this is just following this alien who takes over Andrew Martin's life for a time, and kind of his slow, kind of him beginning to understand what it's like to be a human and why we love the things we love and why we act the way we act, and just kind of his slow just shift into human culture and the way his perspective changes. And I thought it was really well done, really funny. There were several laugh out loud moments, and I'd be going through and kind of chuckling, and then there would be this like completely profound sentence just like inserted in this middle of this funny paragraph. It read really quick. It only took me a couple hours to read this. And I highly recommend you pick up The Humans. All right, next up, let's talk about The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This is a somewhat polarizing book. A lot of people were reading this back at the beginning of the year, and people have very mixed opinions on it. So just a quick overview, although I'm sure you've heard about it. This follows Zachary, who finds his way... Man, I don't even know quite how to describe it. He ends up in this situation in this kind of magical library with doors that lead different places, with secret societies. All these are great buzzwords, and that's, I think, why this book was getting so much buzz other than the author. It has all these words in it that are kind of like, ooh, I want to read that. This book is confusing. I will grant you that. Zachary, our main character, doesn't know what's happening most of the time, and you, as the reader, are kind of in the same position. It's a little confusing. You're not sure what's happening, but the writing is extremely beautiful, so you kind of keep reading. Now, like I said, I know there's a lot of mixed opinions on this book, and I don't disagree with the criticisms of this book. It does lack plot. It does have pacing issues. The writing, I completely understand how some people read it as pretentious. I see all those things. For whatever reason, it still works for me. The writing just pulled me in, and I wanted to keep reading, and I wanted to just soak in this language and soak in this beautiful picture that she was creating with this writing. It's also a book that I feel like is going to improve on reread. Like, I feel like I'm going to be able to reread it again and again and again and find more, like dig out more that I didn't notice the first time through. I feel like there's lots and lots of layers in this book, and I'm really looking forward to picking it up again, hopefully fairly soon, and reading it again, just because I think there's a lot that I missed the first time that I'm going to find in the second read through. I recommend The Starless Sea. It's okay if it's not for you, I get it, but I think it was fantastic. All right, next up, we're going to talk about some YA, a dystopian called The Grace Here by Kim Liggett. I would describe this book as a combination of The Hunger Games, The Handmaid's Tale, and Lord of the Flies. We follow a very kind of patriarchal society. So when they reach their teens, it's believed that girls possess a sort of magic that makes people do things that are, not the norm, makes all the men fall in love with them and all these things. And so in the 16th year, all the girls that hit their 16th year are sent out into the woods to live in this kind of closed community within these walls. And they have 1 year out there, just the girls, to kind of expel their magic, to get rid of their magic out into the world. And so they come back and can live normal, submissive lives. But it's always after this year, they've had no communication with their society. These girls come back. There's always less girls coming back than went. They're always kind of near death. They're starving. They're pretty beat up. We follow one girl who's, now I can't think of her name, Tierney. We follow Tierney in her 16th year as she goes out to live with all the other 16-year-old girls within these walls for 1 year, and just her journey through that year and what's going on. And it's really interesting. It's one of those books I couldn't quite put down. I just kept wanting to know what happened. So I read through it in a day or 2 days. I just think it handles certain topics really well, like how we deal, like how we compete with other people, and how we try to best other people to, to the harm of other people even, and how we make up explanations for things we don't understand. And we talk about magic and fantasy and all these things when maybe it's just something we don't understand how it works. And yeah, I thought it was really well done and just super interesting. There are some cautions in this book. I wouldn't give it to a super young reader, but I just thought it was absolutely fascinating and would recommend it. Also, I really love this cover. And I love that you pick up this cover and you're like, ooh, pretty, it's pink, and there's this, pretty girl on the cover, and it's nothing like what's on the inside of the book. I think it's really well done. So anyway, The Gray Tear by Ken Liggett. You should. Okay, next book. What are we on? Book 8? And for this one, I want to talk about In an Absent Dream by Shannon Maguire. This is part of the Wayward Children series. I read the first book, Every Heart a Doorway, several years ago and didn't like it at all. And so I hadn't picked up the rest of the books in the series. But this year I had multiple people tell me that the rest of the books in the series were much better. And whereas the first book kind of sets a foundation for the world, they can all be read separately and on their own. So I picked up more of them. And I really loved most of them. But this is by far my favorite. In an Absent Dream is technically book 4 in the series. And if you don't know much about the series, it's portal fantasy. So it follows kids, for example, like in Alice in Wonderland, who have found their way into a fantastical world and then have to come back and live in the real world. And so in this book, we follow Lundy, who finds her way into what's called the Goblin Market. And it just talks about, they use the phrase true value a lot, because in the Goblin Market, you have to trade for everything, but it has to be true value. You're not trying to get a deal, you're trying to trade equally. So you may trade pencils for a pastry or whatever. But how the deals that you make in this world always have effects that you may not realize. And so what true value really means, and what truly is valuable, and what's worth, what's worth certain things, and what you, I'm not explaining this well at all. Like the value of certain things in your time and the actions that you take, how those things are kind of reflected in the value you get back. And I just thought it was really interesting, really well done, would highly recommend. Even if you don't read the rest of the series, I would highly recommend that you pick up this one. All right, 2 more to go. Let's talk about Stepsister by Jennifer Donnelly. This is a fairy tale. It's not a retelling. It's a continuation of the Cinderella story. So this book starts where Cinderella ends. Cinderella has gone off to marry her prince, and we are left with the stepmother and stepsisters. And this story follows them. It primarily follows one sister, Isabel, and her story of what happens after Cinderella has left their home. This book really plays with the idea of being who we want to be versus being what people expect us to be. And how, if we're called ugly and fat and mean, that's who we become, because that's what's constantly being spoken into us, and fighting against what's expected of you and being what you truly want to be. It deals with that in some really interesting ways. I do want to read you this one little section, this conversation. This world, the people in it, they sort us. They put us in crates. You are an egg. You are a potato. You are a cabbage. They tell us who we are, what we will do, what we will be. Because they're afraid of what we could be. But we let them do it, Hugo said angrily. Why? Because we're afraid of what we could be, too. And I think this handles really well the concept of hurt and moving on from hurt, like dealing with it, getting it out in the open and moving on. And yeah, this was a really fascinating story. I'm not a big one for villain stories, but I thought this was super, super well done. Also, this cover. Okay, we've got 2 more books to go. Oh, I thought I only had 1. Okay, we have 2 more books to go. The first one is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. A bunch of us read this fall for the Fall Into Reading Challenge. This is science fiction that reads like historical fiction. we follow this woman, Dana or Dana. This is in 1976. This book was written in the 70s, so it's set in the 70s, and she is a black woman, and she time travels accidentally. There's no logic to it. She just gets pulled back in time to the antebellum South on a plantation, on a farm. And she ends up saving a little white boy's life. And then she ends up, this happens multiple times, 6 or 7 times, I think. She gets pulled back to the past and then sent forward again back to her life. And she's always sent back to the same place or these same people. And it just keeps happening, and she has no control over it. Yeah, again, I feel like I've said this about a lot of the books, but I thought this was really thoughtfully done. The way Octavia Butler handled the idea of a modern day black woman being put on a plantation and being viewed as a slave, and how that would look through modern eyes, how it would feel for someone who's more modern, and just some of the challenges and the expectations of that. And it's just a really good story about her relationship that she develops with these people in the past, about her relationship with her husband in the present day. Just about these different conflicts that come up and the way things are resolved, and the hopes that you have for people, that, you know, people are people and we screw up and we fail. But yeah, this was my first experience with Octavia Butler, and I'm really excited to pick up more from her because I was just really impressed with the way this was written. All right, the last one I want to talk about is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this. This has been getting a lot of buzz recently, and it's kind of one of those books that I don't know, I just don't think you want to know a lot about before you go into it. But in this book, we follow our main character, Piranesi, who lives in a house, I guess, but it's kind of a labyrinth of a house. It's huge, it's infinite, it doesn't end. And basically his life is exploring this house. He kind of explores and charts the different halls and passageways and the statues and all the things that are part of this labyrinth that he's in. He kind of charts it all and spends his life just exploring and charting it. There's floods that come in, so he keeps track of the floods, and so he knows when it's safe to be certain places and when it's not. And then other things start happening, and that's where I'm not going to tell you much more. But other things come in, other characters come in, and you start questioning certain things, and I will leave you with that because it's a short book. I don't want to give you too much, but it's an odd little book. And I'm guessing, I haven't heard a lot of reviews of it yet, but I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of people that probably don't like it. I think it's going to be pretty polarizing, kind of like the Starless Sea. But it's such a beautiful little book. And again, it's another one that I want to pick up again soon and reread it because I think there's a lot more in there to dig out. But yeah, it's short. It's under 300 pages. I think it might be under 200 pages. It's quite short. So I would recommend giving it a try, seeing what you think. Yeah, I thought it was really, really good. So that is it. 10 top reads, or 10 great reads. That's what we're calling this. 10 great reads of 2020. I would love to hear what some of your favorite reads of 2020 were. Also, remember, my top 5 is going to be coming out later this week, so make sure you're subscribed. And if you have any guesses of what didn't show up on this list that's very possibly on the top 5 list, I would love to hear those too. You can probably guess at least some of them. So put that down below. And yeah, again, make sure you're subscribed so you can get that top 5 video when it comes out. And that's it. So thank you for watching.